everybody, Aaron here, helping musicians get better, faster, and what you just heard was the Florida Allstate 11 and 12 Euphonium etudes. Alright, so let's dig into what I would expect the judges to be looking for in these two etudes. We're going to start with the lyrical. Really quick before we get way too into it though, I'm using a different edition of the Roshu book, so if I'm playing some stuff that you don't see or some grace notes or something like that, the one you have is probably correct. Just keep that in mind as we go forward. So right off the bat, you kind of have an odd rhythm, so make sure that you're not cutting the 8th tied to a dotted 8th into the 16th. That very first rhythm that you have, make sure you're not cutting that too long or too short. Make sure that it's sitting where it needs to be. Practicing with a metronome, hitting the 8th notes is going to help you really find that. All right, so first, watch out for this weird rhythm that we have at the beginning, the 8th tied to a dotted 8th with a 16th. Just make sure we're not cutting that 8th going into the new bar too short, but also not playing it overly long either. Make sure that it's kind of sitting right in that pocket. This whole etude, I highly suggest practicing with 3/8 notes going on every beat, ding dun dun ding dun dun ding, as opposed to practicing it with da da da, just for the exactness of it all. Also, don't feel like you need to establish your piano at a super soft level. I like to think about it in these types of situations like if I'm playing and I'm just trying to be a little bit quiet. So I'm not going out of my way to be overly quiet. So that gives me, one, I'm more comfortable, but also gives me a place to grow and decay if I need to. Otherwise, the really, really big tip I have overarching of this entire thing is the way that the breath marks and the pacing are gonna be. There really isn't anything in terms of breath marks, but there's a lot of 8th rests, so I'm gonna use that interchangeably. It kind of works in the same way. But really, you wanna try your best to not breathe where you don't have a rest, because the pacing in here is good enough to where you should be able to pull that off. And if you do have to catch some fill-up breaths somewhere, make sure you do so in places that just make sense. Try not to cut phrases if you don't have to. If you're going to add breaths, I highly suggest you go ahead and put those in your music and make sure that you rehearse with those in there. Yes, it's more impressive to make those phrases, but it's also just really impressive to sound good all the time. Always think about how good can you sound with your air, not necessarily how much sound you can make with your air. It's more impressive to go for longer, but if you need it, don't feel like it's going to ruin your audition if you don't. And then with that 3-bar crescendo with the tied along dotted half notes, make sure that you hold off for a little bit, grow in that 3rd measure, kind of in the middle of that 3rd measure, you maintain the loud, and then we start coming down. So it's not gonna, but in that measure, right? We want to come up, maintain for a little bit, and go back down. And also just make sure the pacing is a little bit good. We don't want to get too loud too fast, and then we don't want to disappear when we start decrescendoing as well. And then when we get the one written forte, really go for it. Let that be known that this is forte. You're going to be playing nice and big. Of course, never louder than lovely, but let us know that we are changing dynamics there. And just some performance things with some of the higher notes, like that G right there before the end. A lot of times they're articulated, so don't slur into things you don't have to slur into, especially if they're higher. That articulation will help you pop those notes out. And when it comes to the end of this thing, try your best. I would suggest not slowing down into the fermata. In a performance, it would be great. In an audition situation, you kind of want to play it a little bit more safe. So I would suggest trying to maintain your tempo to the fermata, because there is no written. You never know if you're gonna have a stickler judge or somebody who's gonna want you to make more music or whatever. So if you do what's actually on the paper, you have an argument for what you're doing. If you start adding a lot of things, it gets hard to justify it in that situation, especially because you can't verbally speak for yourself. So I tend to caution you to stay more to what the paper is doing. But moving on to the Voxman, the technical etude. This one's also kind of it gets rhythmically weird, so just watch out for what we have to do, especially in the 3rd measure with the 16th rest before that little 16th note run. And there's some traps, the 16th rest at the beginning of measures, things like that. That's kind of the trap, but what really I would be looking out for as a judge, and I would kind of be like making sure that I hear exactly what needs to be going on, is actually in anything that's like longer. So stuff like 8ths tied over the bar to another 8th, dotted quarters tied to an 8th note that then is preceded by, other 8th notes or some rhythmic pattern. Anything that's a little bit longer, I'm gonna make sure that you're playing it for its entire given value. It's really easy to get caught up in what I call like fast note proximity syndrome, where because there are fast notes, therefore everything is a little bit faster. Another big issue is we have a lot of big jumps, C to A flat, F to A flat, some big jumps there. And a lot of times they are articulated. I think most of the time they're articulated. So make sure when you go from the lower note to the higher note, you articulate. That's gonna help the higher note kind of ping out there a little bit. Watch out for your dynamics across the board. Here we have Mezzo Piano. I want to establish that as a kind of a comfortable bass, so I have somewhere to go with the pianos, but I don't have to play too loud when I get to the very articulated section, the forte section later on. And then also with the crescendos, I don't want to, get too brass, too shrill. And so that gives me some spot to move in with that. And lastly, with the articulated section, it's going to be really easy to kind of chop things up. Make sure that that airstream is going all the way through. There's no staccatos written or anything like that. We do have the accent. So to make the accent stick out, we're going to play everything at a more comfortable articulation level and let that accent stick out. Right, just letting that kind of work and the air work with the articulation for us. And finally, to contradict what I said on the lyrical, this one does slow down in the last bar, but don't fall in love with it. It is not, it's a 1 bar slowdown. So don't D, da, da, D. It's not quite that much. We're just kind of pumping the brakes on the stop side, kind of a thing. And I do suggest, if you have a tuning trigger or some way to kind of maintain it, I do suggest going, when you go from that F sharp to 3, D, D, D. For me, I just found that motion going down to the C and using this, even though the intonation is going to be pretty bad with the 1 and 3, is easier than me moving into a index finger. People with 4th valves up here, I highly suggest the 1 and 3, but again, it's an intonation game. Intonation more important than the smoothness, so if the intonation's really bad on that last C, of course it's the last note. We don't want to end on a super, super sharp note. So look into that, but that is a little bit of a tip for you. If you can manipulate that that intonation, go for it. Keep in mind that all these tips are just for the etude portion, and you have to remember the scales are where you're going to get most of your points. So make sure that you have a full and complete audition ready to go when we have to do this thing. But keep in mind, the people who do really well on the scales tend to trend to be the ones who win these auditions. But as far as this audition goes, this is what I've got for you today. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button and go ahead and share it with some of your colleagues who might also be taking this audition. Feel free to go ahead and subscribe to make sure that you get notified whenever I upload anything new. We're about to get away from the all-state content. We're kind of rolling to the end of that, so we have a lot more unboxings and more pedagogical information coming up, so just stay tuned for that. But anyway, y'all, my name's Aaron. Be happy, never satisfied. Good luck at Allstate this year.